Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at land usage as part of your ecology studies. So we're going to be looking at deforestation and peat extraction and how that affects the biodiversity in an area.
Hi everyone. Okay, so this is our next human impact video when we're looking at how human actions is impacting biodiversity. So we're looking at deforestation and peat extraction in this video, which is sometimes also called land use. So use of the land, how we're using it, and how that's causing loss of biodiversity. First of all, we've kind of mentioned this already, but the bigger the human population gets, the more people we have, the more land we need because of the more space that we're going to take up. And we're going to need it to build houses on, we're going to need it to farm, to get food for us, and we're going to need to extract resources from the land. And so that means the more of us there are, the more space we take up, the less space there is for other animals and plants to live, which naturally means that we're going to decrease biodiversity. If we take away the places that they live or the resources that the animals and plants need, then they're not going to be able to survive. So biodiversity is reduced when natural landscapes, so land, the way the land would be before we came and changed it, if we change it and if we clear it or change it in any way, extract things from it, dig it up, chop down trees, that's what we're going to look at today, then we're going to reduce biodiversity. So why do we need to clear the land? So here you can see some lovely forest over on half my picture, and then you can see where that forest, the land changes drastically and becomes flat farmland that is clearly only being planted with kind of one species of plant. So why do we need to clear the land? What's the point of what is the land being used for by humans? So we need to clear land in order to build buildings. So we need to have flat land in order to start building upwards. So that means chopping down trees or maybe excavating the land so it's flat in order for us to build buildings such as houses, schools, hospitals, everything. So quarrying or extracting resources just means us digging up materials from under the ground. So we have to clear the land first, so chop down any trees or plants, and then we're going to dig deep down underground, which means we're going to be looking for things like metal ores, coal, oil, gas, all the fossil fuels are being dug up from underground. And also peat, which is something we're going to talk about later as well. Anything where you're kind of blasting or you're kind of digging up using big machinery to disrupt the land. Mostly we have to clear the land first, but also then you could be destroying habitats. You could also be removing nutrients and resources from the soil, and also you could be then causing climate change or global warming by doing things with those materials, and they could also leach and poison the land and things like that. So lots of issues with quarrying. To grow crops, you need bare soil. So you need to flatten the land, remove any trees and anything, and you need bare soil in order to plant seeds, sow seeds or plant small plants. And you might need to dig drainage channels around it to kind of drain the water off, because you don't want that soil being waterlogged. So then you're digging up the edges and kind of changing the water movement as well. And then to farm animals, you need flat land again, where you need grassland. So you need to, if it was left, it might turn into a woodland or a forest, but you chop down all the trees and then you keep it flat and you graze your animals there so they eat the grass and they keep it down so that you just have flat grassland where they can kind of eat and chew that grass that they need to kind of supplement their diet. So sheep, pigs, cows, any of those animals. So our first kind of major example of us in clearing the land is deforestation. So deforestation just means the cutting down of large areas of trees or forests. And sadly, over half the world's rainforest, which is a specific type of forest, has already been cut down just in the last 75 years. And that's just to make space for all the things we've talked about. So reasons why we chop down forests: building, for wood. So the wood is a resource. So it's a resource. People might need wood to chop down wood to burn for a fuel source, or they might chop it down in order to get timber in order to build houses. So it's sort of a twofold thing. And they're chopping the wood down and they're going to use it to build, as well as build on the land that they're chopping the wood down. Farming animals we've talked about, so making space for grazing. Crops we've talked about, so getting bare soil. Palm oil is one where so the land is cleared so that palm oil trees can be planted. So they chop down kind of a diverse mixture of different species of trees in the rainforest. It's normally in tropical areas where they do this, and they're replacing it with planting just one type of tree, the palm oil tree, And the palm oil is planted because the oil that can be extracted from the palm oil can be used as a biofuel, but also it's used in a lot of cosmetic products, toothpaste, some makeups, moisturizers, loads of things. If you check the back of packets nowadays, you'll see a lot of them contain palm oil. But that has come at a price because obviously they've reduced the biodiversity by chopping down all of the big forests that had all the homes and the specific species that had all the fruit on and various things that animals needed to live and survive. And we've replaced it with just these palm oil plants, which actually grow quite short, and they are just one species, so they don't help provide all the food and everything, the different habitats that the animals need to live there. So problems that deforestation causes. So what are the issues that happen when we chop down loads of trees and forest areas? Firstly, as I said, we're reducing biodiversity. So sort of indirectly, we're removing habitats and food sources for animals because we're taking down their shelter, we're taking down their sources of food. And we're also directly killing and removing plants. So by chopping down the trees and the plants, you're killing them and removing them from the space. So that reduces the number of species and the different amount of plant species in that area, and it removes the large kind of structures, the habitats, and the places that provide the food and the seeds that all of the animals eat. And so therefore they're all going to leave or have to migrate or move elsewhere to find forests to live in, because that's the habitat they are designed to live in. Eventually this is going to result in extinction, and has already resulted in some extinction and some losses, because we've removed so much area that there's just not enough space, forest space, rainforest space left for all of the animals that need to live there to survive. So eventually there's going to be not enough space left, and the species will start to go extinct even more. Soil erosion is another problem. So the big deep roots of those big trees, they help to hold all of that soil together. They're containing it all and holding it all together with their network of roots. When you take away those trees and the roots that hold them all together, then that soil becomes really loose and can be washed away really easily. It can fall down, it can start mudslides and kind of start shifting and moving around. When you plant sort of crop plants and other things on there, they're not trees, their roots are not deep enough to hold all that soil, so it's going to move around. Flooding, so this is linked to the soil erosion. So the soil is good for preventing flooding because it helps to absorb a large amount of water. And we create kind of, by holding that soil up on banks of rivers and things like that, stops it falling into the river, so the river can kind of flow past nicely. When you get soil erosion and those top layers of soil can fall down and slide off, it can't hold as much water, so more water runs straight off the land and runs into rivers and lakes, making them fuller and more swollen, which means the water levels are higher. And it also, the flooding or the soil erosion can cause soil to build up and narrow those lakes and those rivers, so there's less space for the water, which means they flood and overflow. Increasing risk of carbon dioxide. So if you have fewer trees, less photosynthesis is going to be occurring, so less carbon dioxide is going to be being absorbed from the atmosphere. It's as simple as that. So this is one of those two-pronged approaches we talked about. This in the carbon cycle. Photosynthesis of plants is the only method that removes carbon dioxide actively from the atmosphere. Everything else we're doing that's contributing to global warming and climate change is putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then if we're also chopping down loads of trees and not replacing them, then we're giving less opportunity for that carbon dioxide to be taken out of the atmosphere as well. Also, if you're chopping down trees for wood, which you're going to burn, or you leave wood that's been chopped down and just leave it to decay or rot nearby and not use it, then both of those things also release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as well. So both of those in two ways contribute to increasing the amount of carbon dioxide, which obviously then increases its contribution to climate change. And we've talked about the impact that climate changes can have on biodiversity as well in the previous video. So how can we kind of combat this or prevent this impact? There's kind of two ways, and they might talk to you about this in questions. They might ask you to evaluate methods or talk about programs or initiatives or legislation and treaties that have been signed. But you can talk about how they could manage forests sustainably. So if we are growing forests or using forests to get wood, for whether it's for fuel or for building material or whatever, there's ways of managing it so it is sustainable. So only chopping down small numbers of trees at a time. Reforesting, so planting as many trees as you chop down, or if not, planting more. And normally we plant saplings, so they'll be constantly being grown from seeds, And when they get to small trees like this in the picture, they'll be put and planted in, and then they get protected by these little mesh bags to kind of stop any animals from eating them when they're too young, to make sure they survive and start growing into adult trees. And then once they've done that, you leave those areas that you've just planted those new plants in for about 25 to 30 years before you go back and harvest them again, so the trees can grow large enough to have made an impact and made this new habitat. Some say they wait to get logs of a certain size or trees of a certain size before you cut them down, and then that means that you're not chopping down anything that's too young and is able to keep growing. And then, so that's kind of temperate forests, the idea of what we use for getting wood from, and sort of trying to protect them in a sustainable way but still use them. Protection for kind of large tropical rainforests like the Amazon rainforest on like a really big global scale. So if you're not sure, the Amazon rainforest is this kind of these green patches here. So there's a couple of techniques that governments and been working with the people who live and work around these forests who would be chopping them down to try and prevent that. So encouraging farmers on land nearby to grow trees and crops at the same time. So don't chop down all the trees and clear the land completely. You can thin the trees out and chop down some, but grow your crops amongst them so that they can benefit from the shade of the trees, for example, the extra nutrients they might get from the leaves dropping and enriching the soil. And that can stop them chopping down as many trees. Education, so educating the people about the impact that they're kind of chopping down of the trees and the deforestation, the impact that's going to be having on species locally, and why it's important to try and be sustainable and conserve the rainforest. Legally protecting areas that are very highly damaged. Large bits of the Amazon do have some protective laws around them to stop people from chopping down the trees, or making sure that it's being sustainably managed. And ways of being able to check that, because the rainforest, as you can see from the map, it's huge areas, and same with places in Africa as well. Huge areas of tropical forest that is hard to sample and look at. So using satellite imaging, so using satellites and other things to take aerial photographs of large areas of the rainforest so they can check that there's no differences, there's not large areas being cut down when they shouldn't be, and make sure that all the rules about being sustainable are being followed. Okay, so now we've gone to peat extraction. This is something for definitely the AQA exam board need you to know about as an example. So peat is a soil-like substance that's extracted from the ground. Here you can see in my image, this is the layers of peat here. And what's been happening, it's been dug into and it's being extracted out and cut into these bricks, which are then being left on the top to dry. So it's formed in waterlogged, boggy areas where mosses and other plants, you can kind of see, it kind of looks like grass, but they are mosses. And they grow, but when they die, because the air is so waterlogged, it provides anaerobic conditions. So there's lack of oxygen there. So they don't fully decompose and decay like normal plant matter would. So that dead matter has like built up in layers that are partially decayed material over thousands of years. So in a similar way to kind of how coal is formed, where it's pushed down and layers of it is built over the years, and it contains like dead plant and animal matter from millions of years ago that didn't fully break down. This is similar, but it's created in this unique environment of like a waterlogged wetland or bog. So what do we use it for? So it's been used for a very long time, actually. It's as a fuel. So it's being burned similar to in places where they didn't have coal. So in places like Scotland and Ireland, they used to have been for a very long time extracting peat from the ground and burning it as a fuel. So growing plants is the other main use of peat that's being used all over Europe and the UK still. It has this unique ability to kind of hold enough water to keep the plants alive, but don't hold too much, so it lets it free drain out as well to make sure the plants get the perfect amount of water. And also it has these nutrients that it contains, and it can hold extra nutrients really well if you add fertilizer or something to it. So it makes it really perfect for growing plants in pots or containers, which is what we normally call compost. This is an example of a bag that you can see says peat-free compost on it that you can now often see in most garden centres. So one of the main ways of improving and reducing our reliance and use on peat is to come up with peat-free compost. so that we use that instead of using peat to grow plants at home or in nurseries or in kind of commercial greenhouses where they're growing plants. They would always, and for many, many years, have just exclusively used peat. So now we're trying to move away from that and reduce our reliance on peat for growing plants in. And you can normally see, if you go to a garden centre, you'll see this peat-free compost pretty much everywhere now, and encouraging people to try and buy it. There is still peat compost available though, so it's not something we've 100% eradicated, but the government has a target to try and get peat-free by 2030, I believe. So we're hoping that we'll eventually stop using it entirely. Why is it bad? Why should we stop extracting peat from the ground? Well, it reduces biodiversity in the same way that deforestation does. You're removing a habitat. And you'll notice here that there is water, like a stream, running down this image. What's actually happened before they can get the peat out, they're leaving it to dry and they don't want it to be too wet. So they dig these channels in order to drain all the water from where the peat is before they dig in to start extracting it, and then kind of remove it and drain it away from the bog. And that's really an issue, because then you've removed the water from what is a wetland or a bog that is supposed to be wet, and so that habitat has now been destroyed. As well as being extracting the peat, you've removed the kind of water, so it's no longer this kind of unique environment. And there's a lot of species that are specially adapted to live in bogs, and so they're losing their habitat. A lot of the bogs now in the UK and wetlands in the UK are now sites of specific science interest. So they're now what we call SSSIs. So they are protected because we've lost, nearly 90% of them. If you burn peat, as we said, it's used as a fuel, you're going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which we've also, like we said with the wood, is obviously contributing to global warming. And when the peat is dug up and left out like that to dry, it starts to decay. So because it starts to decay, you've got microorganisms starting to break it down, and they're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because they're respiring. So remember, it doesn't do it, but the decay process is the microorganisms releasing it. And so that's obviously contributing to global warming and climate change again. And then also increase the risk of flooding. So again, you're draining all that water off. That would be a really large sink of water that would have been kept in that bog, in that wetland. If you're draining that off and removing it, and then removing the peat which holds all the water, then where's that water going to go? It's going to fill into lakes and rivers and ponds nearby, which is going to increase the chances of them overflowing, which leads to flooding. That's it. So we've talked about deforestation and its impact, and peat extraction and its impact, and why humans use the land, and ways all of these can impact biodiversity. So this is something you just need to kind of know and get some sort of the difficulties and disadvantages of these actions by humans on the land and how it can impact biodiversity.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I have unexplained scratches.